Hello and welcome to your Chapter 7 lecture video on the skeletal system. So in this video we're going to get into the macro and microscopic structures of bone. We'll talk about how bone is formed, its different functions, and then get into joints and joint movements. There also is a separate PowerPoint that I pulled out that has just the bones listed. It kind of goes through all the different bones of the body and it talks about them in more detail. That is more for our lab, so that's why I pulled it out of this lecture chapter. So we'll cover that material in lab, but you should still review it, you should still know it. Okay, so basic introduction to your skeletal system. So skeleton is a word that refers to the dried framework of the body. It is strong enough for weight-bearing activity, yet light enough for movement. It kind of has this balance, and we'll see, we'll talk about the structures, the structure of bone that gives it those qualities. Bones are organs. They are living organs. If you break your bone, it hurts, it has nerves, it bleeds, there's blood supply, and that blood supply also allows it to heal. And so bones are living organs. The skeletal system itself consists of multiple organs. It is an organ system, so it has multiple organs. Yes, the bones, but also tendons, ligaments, and some cartilage that function in the joints. The basic functions of bones, they are sites of muscle attachment. They provide protection and support of the tissues underneath, blood cell production, hematopoiesis. They also store inorganic salts and bear weight and allow movement. And that kind of goes along with that muscle attachment, is the allowing movement. And so those are the basic functions. We'll talk about those in more detail. And then lastly, these two divisions of the skeletal system, both the axial and appendicular skeleton. We'll get more into that in lab. Essentially, axial is the axis. It's the central channel of the body. And appendicular is appendages. Those are your arms and legs. So looking at the basic structure of bones, we can talk about the bones according to shape. We can classify bones for different reasons. One of those is basically is looking just at the shape. So you have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. A lot of these kind of look like they sound. Long bones are like in your fingers and your arms and your legs and your feet. Those are all long bones because they're longer than they are wide. Short bones are equal length and width, so bones in your wrists and ankles. Also, your kneecap is a sesamoid bone. This is a round bone that is specifically embedded in a tendon. So you have, yes, your patella, your kneecap, but also under your foot, under your big toe, there are two small bones, two small sesamoid bones in that tendon. Flat bones, that's things like your scapula, your breastbone, the bones on the skull, those kind of things, your ribs, those are all flat bones, this broad shaped surface. And then irregular bones, things like your vertebrae, your facial bones, have various shapes and don't really follow any kind of conformed pattern. When we talk about structures of bones, typically we're always looking at long bones just because the others don't quite have as distinguished of features. And most of your bones in your body are going to be long bones. So long bones, they have the two ends, which are called epiphyses. So there's that epi prefix, meaning upon. So the epiphyses are the ends of your long bones. That's what's forming joints with those adjacent bones. There is articular cartilage on the end of your long bones. So covering the epiphyses is this layer of hyaline cartilage that helps with shock absorption and basically prevents the bones from rubbing together. And so in articular, this word articular, articulate, that refers to joints. So where things come together is an articulation. So the articular cartilage is where the bones come together. The shaft of the bone is the diaphysis. So you have the ends or the epiphyses. The portion that runs through it is the diaphysis. That connects the two epiphyses is the diaphysis. There's also something called the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate. This is a line of cartilage that essentially stays uncalcified until you reach a certain age, and then it hardens, it calcifies finally, and your bones stop developing. But up until that point, that's essentially the part of the bone that is growing. And so you hear, especially if you watch a lot of crime shows, they kind of very commonly will talk about, oh, you know, well, we looked at her growth plate and her growth plate was still open, or the growth plate wasn't closed yet, calcified yet. And so they can use that to try and help determine age. There is a layer of connective tissue on the outside of bones called the periosteum around the bone, periosteum. That covers it, and it is continuous with the ligaments and tendons that attach to bones. So the connective tissue structures that help to hold muscles and bones together is also continuous completely with the outer covering of the bone. So when you hear someone pulling a muscle or tearing a muscle off their bone, they're literally tearing the outer covering of the bone off when they do that. It's very painful. Inside is called a medullary cavity. So, oh, I'm sorry, missed this note. Yeah, well, that's the same thing. So inside the diaphysis is this hollow chamber called the medullary cavity. That is essentially where a lot of bone marrow can be stored. You can have major, larger blood vessels flowing through there. It adds that space. It also helps to give bones that lightness, so that way they aren't too heavy. It's lined with a thin layer of cells called the endosteum. So endosteum inside, periosteum on the outside of the bone. And again, like I said, it's filled with bone marrow, and we'll look at the functions of bone marrow. So bone's shape makes its functions possible. Thinking about those things like allowing levers for movement and sites for muscle attachment, having bones that have projections and processes, those bony features that we call landmarks, are places where muscles can attach. So any things like grooves for blood vessels and nerves, depressions for articulations where one bone meets the other, projections off of the bone, any kind of ridges and bumps that you feel in your bones are all there for a reason. It's not just kind of, oh, this looks like a pretty shape. No, those are sites of muscle attachments a lot of times, because where muscles attach to bone and they pull on it, it causes bone to deposit more bone tissue. And so that essentially causes bone to grow larger projections right there. We've talked in lab a little bit about the types of bone tissue. So bones have both compact and spongy bone tissue inside of them. All bones have a blend of both. Compact bone is going to be along the outside, the diaphysis, the wall of it, the epiphyses as well. It's what's giving it that strength and rigidity. The epiphyses inside are filled with spongy bone, but again, the outside is still compact bone to help reduce that weight. And then spongy bone consists of those branching trabeculae rather than the concentric osteons that we see in compact bone, which again are going to help give it that stacking strength. Think about like a brick house or a cinder block building. The blocks stacked on top of each other, very similarly shaped, give it a lot of strength. Whereas the spongy bone, having this lattice work of trabeculae, helps to redistribute tension. Here you can see just that basic structure of your long bones. We'll get into this in lab as well, but this is a good image just to help you understand the epiphyses, both distal and proximal, your diaphysis, the shaft moving through it, the medullary cavity inside of the shaft that has marrow, blood vessels, nerves, and then you can see these lines right here, these epiphyseal lines. So once they've become calcified, we call them lines. Before they're calcified, they're considered plates. So just something to think about. You have your epiphyseal plate is still cartilaginous tissue that can continue to grow, but once it starts to harden, we consider them epiphyseal lines. And you can also see this thin layer of articular cartilage right here that helps to prevent bones rubbing against each other. Here's a cross section of a long bone. So you can see this outer ring of compact bone with this inner medullary cavity filled with spongy bone. Okay, so now let's look at the microscopic structure of bone tissue. Bone cells, generally they're called osteocytes. We'll look at two different types in this lecture. But osteocytes are located in pits called lacunae. And so when you're thinking about bones, this can get a little, there's some interesting words that are coming up here. But I think your lab manual did a good job of describing compact bone like a piece of Swiss cheese, right? So if you think about a piece of Swiss cheese, or I think it was actually talking about cartilage, but it still worked for us. But if you think about a piece of Swiss cheese, a big hunk of it, you've got the cheese, right? The actual part that you can hold, and then Swiss cheese always has holes inside of it. And so that's kind of what bone tissue is like, except if you just think about the cheese as a really, really hard brick or something, but it still had those pits, it still had those little spaces and holes within it. That's what the lacunae are like in our bone tissue. There are these little spaces and holes that are formed where the bone cells, the osteocytes, actually sit and operate from. So in compact bone, as I was saying, there are those concentric circles called, the circles are, the units are called osteons, but the layers are called the lamellae. Lamellae, lamellated, that's a layering process. And so it's kind of like the rings of a tree. If you think about how the rings of a tree are organized, that's similar to the rings of these lamellae. The lamellae they work out concentrically just like they would in a tree. So from this central canal, from this central point, from this central point, the lamellae kind of go larger and larger outward making the bone larger in diameter. And the central canals are going to have your blood vessels and nerves that supply each of those little osteons, each of those little units of bone. Think about the osteons like an individual brick, and then as the osteons are built around each other, it's like adding more bricks to your wall. And so that's kind of how those are organized. Osteocytes pass nutrients and gases through the matrix via tiny canals called canaliculi. So these canaliculi are like little tiny branches, little tiny perforations in the bone tissue that connect it from one to the next. Going back to our brick example, if you've kind of seen bricks, they're not always, in cinder blocks too, they're not completely 100% solid. They have hollow spaces in the middle, and in those hollow spaces, they fill it with what is it, concrete, or mixed concrete or whatever. And so I'm not a bricklayer, so don't test me on that one. But that's kind of how your bones are too. Your bones have in the bone tissue, they have these small little projections that kind of help to connect from one to the next, so that way they can communicate with each other and they can share nutrients. And then, as we said in our last lecture, or the lecture before this, bone, compact and spongy bone tissue is connective tissue. And so one feature of connective tissue is this ground substance, this extracellular matrix. And so in blood, your ground substance is plasma, so it's very liquidy. In other tissues, your ground substance can be this gel-like fluid. In bone, your extracellular matrix is a mix of collagen and inorganic salt. And that gives it its solid feature, solid nature. Collagen fibers providing strength and resilience, because your bones, they do bend before they break. They can twist, they can move a little bit. There is some ability to handle that tensile strength in your bone that comes from collagen fibers. But the inorganic salts, primarily calcium phosphate, that's what gives bone its actual strength and rigidity. So the hardness and resistance to crushing comes from these inorganic salts. And salts are just refer to particular elemental structures, atomic structures. Don't think like table salt. Don't let yourself get into that mindset. Inorganic salts, calcium phosphate, that's what gives it its strength. So in compact bone, you have the osteocytes and extracellular matrix organized into those osteons that are cemented together. So just like you would have bricks layered together, you have osteons that are all arranged next to each other and then held and cemented with each other. The central canals, as we said, inside of each ringed osteon, have the blood vessels and nerve fibers, and those go throughout the length of the bone tissue. You also have these perforating canals that help to connect one osteon to the one beside it, so that way they can help share blood supply and nerves, sensations, things like that. But like we said, with spongy bone, it's not made of those osteocytes. Oh, I'm sorry, it's made of osteocytes, but they lie within the trabeculae. It's not organized into the neat osteon circles. So here you can see that, again, you have this outer superficial ring of compact with the deeper spongy bone. You can see the osteon structures of the compact bone all ringed up next to each other with their central canals and perforating canals. Right, perforating there, central there. You can see these things that kind of look like little spiders embedded in the bone. Those are the osteocytes. I'm going to zoom in here. So each one of these little kind of dark circles, that is the little pit. That's the lacunae, and inside the lacunae, the circle, or the pit rather, that's where the osteocyte would sit. And then those little things that look like cracks, like legs coming off of the spider's body, those are the canaliculi that help each ring talk to itself, or each layer talk to its neighbor. And so each layer within the osteon is a lamellae. The lamellae is filled with the lacunae, these pits. And then inside of the lacunae, you have the osteocytes that help to detect bone status. And then to help them to exchange information and get nutrients, you have the canaliculi that connect from the central canal all the way to these distal lamellae. Okay, so now let's get into our bone function now that we've kind of talked about its basic structure. So we said bone provides support and protection. It gives the basic shape to the body, so it provides this general framework for our body's shape. It has bones like your pelvis and your femurs, your tibia, lower limbs to support your body's weight. Even your lower vertebrae are thicker designed to handle the body weight. Bones of the skull protecting the eyes, the ears, the brain, rib cage and shoulder girdle, the heart and the lungs, and the pelvic girdle for abdominal organs, reproductive organs, things like that. So you can kind of connect where the bone is and think about what major structures are underneath it. Bones act as a source of movement. We call them the levers of movement because with muscles, that's what's actually causing the contraction. But if we didn't have bones, we would kind of just be like jellyfish, just kind of like contracting and flopping all over the place and, just kind of not really being able to direct where that movement goes. But by having bones, we can lever the muscles and actually provide for directional movement. Bones are the site of blood cell formation, of hematopoiesis. So when we're embryonic and it's still developing in the womb, the yolk sac is what starts blood cell formation. But by week 8 to 10, 14, we've started to have bone formation happening, and so that starts to shift. The hematopoiesis starts to shift into the bones. Liver and spleen also help with blood cell formation when we're young. But the bone marrow that occupies the medullary cavity, that is the site of your blood cell production, specifically in the red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is the place of hematopoiesis. It fills the spongy bone spaces in the skull, ribs, sternum, clavicles, vertebrae, and pelvis in adults. The reason we classify it as adults because in children, most of their bones are filled with red bone marrow. A lot of their long bones are filled with red bone marrow because children have a higher need for blood cell production. They have much, much higher rates of growth and repair than we do as adults. And so children, a lot of their bones contain red bone marrow. But as they age, that starts to shift into yellow until really the red bone marrow is only in these few bones here. So red bone marrow, it's going to be producing red and white blood cells as well as platelets. And yeah, the color of red bone marrow comes from the oxygen-carrying pigment and hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is in there and it helps to bind to your red blood cells, and that's what gives red marrow its that color. But as we said, red marrow and your long bones especially will convert to yellow bone marrow, and this acts as fat storage. It occupies most of the bone cavities in adults, and if you go to a restaurant and you order bone marrow, you are being served yellow bone marrow. If you see things like vultures, scavengers, breaking open bones, they're eating this yellow bone marrow because it's very high in fat, very high in energy and nutrients. Okay, we said bones act as this storage of inorganic salts, of inorganic elements. So that extracellular matrix, that hard ground substance of bone, is rich in calcium salts, that calcium phosphate. Calcium is very important in a lot of our metabolic processes for your nervous system function, your muscle system function, blood clotting, as it says. And so our bones have kind of co-evolved, our bodies co-evolved this need for calcium with this great way of being able to store it and use it as bone tissue. And so it acts as this reservoir for body calcium. So when your body calcium levels are low, your body is going to release parathyroid hormone. This comes from your parathyroid glands, and both the hormones do, we'll see. But when blood calcium levels dip low, you release PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that basically causes the osteoclasts, these specific type of bone cells, osteoclasts, to break down your bone and release that bone calcium. And so when if your bone calcium is consistently low and you are not supplementing it with anything, then your body will break down your bones to get it. When blood calcium starts to get too high, the osteoclasts are inhibited, blasts are stimulated by this hormone calcitonin, also from your parathyroid gland. So calcitonin is going to cause bone formation to happen, and so that's through osteoblasts. The way that I remember this is that blasts, that B is for build. So osteoblasts build, osteoclasts destroy. Or you can think clast, there's a C for catastrophe, like breaking something apart. So osteoclasts, parathyroid hormone, break bone down to release calcium. Osteoblasts, calcitonin, build bone to store calcium. Bone also has things like magnesium, sodium, potassium, carbonate ions that our body uses for a variety of functions, for everything from transport across cell membranes to DNA replication. Bones can also be storage sites for things like lead, radium, and strontium, so heavy metal poisoning. Here is this graphic depiction of blood calcium, sorry. My brain, it's right there in front of me and my brain couldn't read it. So when you have decreased blood calcium, again, you can see the thyroid glands, the parathyroid glands are releasing your thyroid hormone, parathyroid hormone there. You can see how it stimulates osteoclasts, and as we said, clasts, that's C for catastrophe, so it's breaking bone down to release blood calcium, and it's going to start then releasing it into the calcium from the urine, and also stimulating vitamin D absorption from the intestines. So all of those things to help you increase your blood calcium absorption. And then you can see when you have increased blood calcium levels, that's coming from your thyroid gland, that calcitonin is released. It's going to inhibit osteoclasts and inhibit increase calcium absorption from the blood. Okay, so now looking at bone development, growth, and repair. So there are two different ways that bones are formed, and before I really kind of get into this, I'll say if you haven't looked at this kind of stuff before, it can be a little daunting, especially when we start getting into like the endochondral ossification. So if you need to kind of make sure that you've already watched, Amoeba Sisters Crash Course, kind of some interesting quick 10-minute YouTube video on this. You do have a video on bone ossification in Connect that we'll probably watch in lab, but it's pretty dense and heavy with the terminology. So just being aware that sometimes this, you might need to see it a couple of times to really get it. Okay, so bones form by replacing existing connective tissues in the fetus. When we're developing in utero, we are first, kind of given this cartilaginous model, and then depending on where it is, there's two different processes for ossification, for this formation of bone tissue. Intramembranous is forming these sheet-like layers of connective tissue, whereas endochondral is from this hyaline cartilage model. And so we'll see most of our bones are this endochondral ossification. Here you can see the intramembranous. You can see how they kind of look like this sheet layer. This is skull bones, so it's kind of hard to see too much detail. And then this endochondral ossification along the ribs, the bones of the arms, the legs, the femurs, the pelvis, that stuff. So starting with intramembranous bones, they come from these sheet-like layers of undifferentiated connective tissue. Broad flat bones from the skull are a classic example. You start with progenitor cells. These are kind of like a stem cell that differentiate into osteoblasts, B for bone-forming cells. Those osteoblasts start to kind of create this bony matrix around themselves, kind of converting the cartilaginous model into forming this spongy bone kind of around them. Think about just like, it's almost like a virus or a plague kind of oozing out around the cells. The osteoblasts are secreting the substance that helps to calcify the tissue around it. Once that happens, the osteoblasts have essentially encased themselves in the matrix. They're considered osteocytes because they're then, their structure starts to shift and change. And so osteoblasts become osteocytes. Specifically. I know we've been talking about osteocytes already as a general bone cell. It's because osteocytes can then produce more osteoblasts. Cells in the membranous tissue that lie outside the developing bone start to create the periosteum. So you have this internal ossification that happens first, and then this start of, once that kind of forms its initial spongy bone layer, then you start to have this periosteum being formed. And that, of course, starts to make the compact bone over the spongy bone. Because, as we said, it's always going to have a thin layer, at least, of compact bone to give it that rigidity over top of the spongy bone. Endochondral bones form a little differently. They start as that hyaline cartilage model that's already in the shape of your future bones, and then they just start to calcify on top of that. Similar to, again, you're going to have osteoblasts doing that. Most of the bones of the skeleton are in this category. First, it's broken down in the diaphysis. They break down the cartilage in the diaphysis. That starts to get replaced with bone and the periosteum on the outside. And then it starts to develop in the epiphyses. You start to get that ossification in the epiphyses secondary. So the primary ossification center, this is when that cartilage in the diaphysis starts to get broken down and invaded by blood vessels, osteoblasts, and they form that primary, that spongy bone in the primary ossification center. From there, they start to lay down compact bone around that diaphysis and kind of form that structure and that shape. And then you start to get these secondary ossification centers later in the epiphyses. So primary is just because it's first, secondary because it comes after. That's really what it means. And so you have these 2 points of ossification of bone development happening, and those two are separated by that epiphyseal plate. It remains between the two ossification centers, this band. I was going to say line and band. This band of hyaline cartilage that separates the two ossification centers. And so these two are kind of like, again, like a spreading little virus, kind of slowly moving closer and closer towards each other, and just being held apart by this plate. Layered cartilage cells undergoing mitosis make up the epiphyseal plate, and so that's where the bone increases in length. So it kind of reaches its maximum diameter, and then it starts to grow in length from there. And it's cartilaginous cells going through mitosis. They essentially are pushing up the epiphyseal plate. You know, as they divide within the epiphyseal plate, they push those cartilaginous cells, older ones, to the edges of the epiphyseal plate, and from there they can then be ossified and calcified to create longer bone. So within the bone cells, we have both osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Bone resorbing, this word resorbing, is essentially breaking down. So it's reabsorbing, but it's resorbing is the way we say it. So bone resorbing cells, your class, break down calcified matrix, whereas bone building blast build, they deposit bone in the calcified cartilage. Sorry, I think I was jumping ahead with myself. The class are also breaking down your calcium. Yeah, sorry, I did say that. I read it weird and my brain kind of jumped around a little bit. Okay, so long bone continues to lengthen while cartilaginous cells of the epiphyseal plate are active. Once the plate ossifies, the bone can no longer grow in length. That's something I've said a couple of times. So it's that epiphyseal plate turning into the epiphyseal line once it's calcified. And compact bone is deposited on the outside of the developing bone. The medullary cavity forms on the diaphysis, the inside, and the osteoclasts are eroding it from the inside. So essentially the osteoclasts along the diaphysis, this clasts are eating away bone from the inside, but then you have osteoblasts on the outside depositing more medullary cavity, or depositing more calcified bone on the outside of it. So it's still keeping it in balance, and that's supposed to how it's be. It's supposed to be, as it breaks down, it also is maintaining the bone density if the clasts and blasts are balanced. Eventually that medullary cavity fills with bone marrow and produces those bone cells. Here is a nice kind of sequential depiction of endochondral ossification. So again, starting with this hyaline cartilage model, you can see that those glassy cells. You start to form and differentiate here. This periosteum, this calcifying cartilage is starting to come into play. You get this primary ossification center throughout the diaphysis, and then you can start to see these clumps here forming into your secondary ossification centers. And then that starts to give rise to this epiphyseal plate that's dividing the diaphysis and the epiphyses. And that's where your bone is growing from at that point. And then you have fully matured bone, which has an epiphyseal line that can no longer grow. You can see these epiphyseal plates, these nice open spaces. Okay, so homeostasis of bone tissue, because as I was saying, you have blast and clast activity happening all throughout your life. This process is called bone remodeling. So on an average of 3 to 5% of bone calcium is exchanged each year, so meaning that your bones are kind of cycling through 3 to 5% of your total bone density, and hopefully that's breaking down and being replaced at the same rate. Clast resorbing, blast depositing. It's controlled mostly through hormones regulating your blood calcium levels, but we'll see that there are other factors that go into bone density maintenance. One of those is nutrition. Vitamin D is needed for calcium absorption. A lot of people tend to be I won't say a lot of people, most of the people I know are vitamin D deficient. So get your vitamin D levels checked. That can definitely affect your body beyond just bone density. Also, hormonal secretions are going to affect your bone remodeling. Growth hormone is going to stimulate division of cartilage cells in the epiphyseal plate and increase your growth rate. That's why we tend to, once we hit puberty, you get this release of growth hormone and you start to shoot up in height. Sex hormones, they start to stimulate ossification at the epiphyseal plates to end growth and height. So growth hormone is secreted before the androgens, your testosterone and estrogen, really start to get ramped up. And so that's why there tends to be this kind of growth in height, and then you start to see the other secondary sexual characteristics come into play. Of course, that isn't always true for everybody. Everybody is, going to be on their own schedule and things like that. But generally, you're going to get this shot up in growth or increase in growth, and then you start to see that increase in sexual hormones. Stuff like physical exercise is also important for bone deposition and bone remodeling. As I said, when muscles pull on bones, that creates stress. It's a good type of stress, but it creates stress on the bone, and that causes your osteoblast activity to increase and create thicker, stronger bones. This doesn't have to be a lot of heavy weight, though. A lot of times, it can just be some light weight bearing activities. You don't have to be doing, your max PRs every time you work out. Just a little bit of resistance. 5, 10, 20 pound weights, anything like that, is going to give you the resistance that you need to stimulate that bone deposition. Things too like walking, having that action of walking and that jarring, that shaking of your bones a little bit as your foot hits the pavement is also another good type of stress. Okay, so that was a lot of our bone function structure stuff. The rest of this is mostly on organization and the joints. So this, I think, is where that I took out some of those bone slides. I think I took those out before I uploaded this PowerPoint for y'all, so hopefully you don't have slides that I don't have in here. If you do, just skip ahead and catch back up. So the skeleton can be organized into two major portions, your axial and appendicular skeleton. Like I said, the axial is the axis. It's the central channel. It's mostly your skull, hyoid bone. This is one in your throat. It sits just above the trachea. The vertebral column and your thoracic cage, the ribs and sternum. So from your head all the way down your vertebral column to your tailbone, the hyoid bone in the throat, and then all of your ribs and your sternum. It does not include the clavicles and the shoulder, the scapula, or the hips. Those are all appendicular. Appendicular, like I said, is the bones of the upper and lower limbs. We talk about the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle is your clavicle and scapula. I also include the humerus in here, which is the bone of the upper arm, but you can see they put it there, so it's fine. So the pectoral girdle, as well as the pelvic girdle, which are your two hip bones. So essentially, the appendicular skeleton is everything from the pectoral and pelvic girdles all the way to your fingertips and your toes, the phalanges. And so it's all of the other bones. In between each of those bones, whether axial or appendicular, there are joints, these articulations. They allow for functional movement between the bones. They enable a wide range of body movement depending on the shape of the bones themselves, the shape of the joint that they form. That's going to determine what type of movement can be allowed. We do classify that movement according to the degree that it allows. There is immovable, which are synarthrotic, so without movement. Slightly movable, amphiarthrotic, and freely movable, diarthrotic. So most of the joints that you think about are these diarthrotic, freely movable joints. You don't really think about the immovable, the synarthrotic ones as joints most likely. We can also talk about the structures that bind them together. So instead of just the functional movement, we can look at the actual connective tissue that's holding them together. Fibrous are dense connective tissue. These tend to be synarthrotic joints. Cartilaginous joints, we're going to look at those that are composed of cartilage. These are your amphiarthrotic. And then synovial joints, which again are the ones you mostly think about, are diarthrotic joints. They have a much more complex structure, but it's that complex structure that really allows for a lot of movement in between them. So your fibrous joints, these are bones that lie in close contact, things like the bones of the skull that hold your head together. We call these sutures specifically. The joints in between your jaw and your teeth, those are type of fibrous joints. You probably don't think about those as joints, but those are fibrous joints. You should know, those should not move, right? That when you feel a loose tooth, you're like, oh, that's not right. But you probably don't think about it as like a fracture. Some of them are slightly movable. The joint between the distal tibia and fibula, these are the two bones in the lower leg. There's some slight movement in between those, but again, if you take your hands on the outside of your skull and you kind of push it together, there's some slight give to your head, but not a whole lot. So yeah, here's just showing those sutures of the skull. And you can feel these sutures. If you kind of take your hand and your fingertips and you trace along these suture lines, you can feel those on your own skull. Cartilaginous joints, connected by either hyaline or fibrocartilage, things like the discs in between your vertebrae that are absorbing shock, the pubic symphysis in between the two pelvic bones, the ribs with the sternum that allow for the slight movement in the rib cage. Again, these have some movement in between them. Your spine can definitely move. The pubic symphysis allows the pelvis to expand during childbirth. So cartilaginous joints have some movement, but you wouldn't really consider them to be, having a wide range of motion. And we don't really classify their movements in these cartilaginous joints. We don't really talk about, as we'll see in our synovial joints, we actually have joint names or names for joint movements. In cartilaginous joints, we don't really name those movements. So synovial joints. These are diarthrotic, so they're freely moving joints. They have a much more complex structure than the other ones. It's not just connective tissue holding them together. There is a whole capsule that we're going to look at. Most joints are synovial joints. They are covered, the articular ends of bones and synovial joints have that articular cartilage, that hyaline cartilage to help with that protection. There's this joint capsule that has an outer layer of connective tissue that's called a synovial membrane, and it secretes this synovial fluid to help lubricate the joints. So you may have heard some of these structures before, especially if someone says, oh yeah, I've got, a tear in my synovial membrane. That can be pretty common to have just like small tears in it that can cause a lot of pain. You also have, some of them have things called meniscus in between them. Again, you might have heard of someone having a torn meniscus. This is an extra layer of fibrocartilage that acts as a shock absorbing pad. There's also things called bursa. You might have heard of bursitis, somebody having bursitis. It's literally like a little fluid-filled pack that just kind of sits in between joints just to add add some more cushioning. This one, says to talk about tendons sliding over bones. They're just kind of in there to make sure things can move freely. There's no sharp edges. Everything is nice and smooth so that it can flow easily. If you think about, like in big machines, like heavy machinery, there's all of those lubricating oils and rubber seals and coverings on things, and they're constantly checking, it's why it's good to take your car to the mechanic so they can check and make sure that no seals have busted, nothing's leaking out, there's no metal rubbing against metal. That's like bone rubbing against bone, and it can create a lot of damage and really inhibit function. And synovial joints, they can also be classified by the shape of their parts and the movements that they allow. So we'll look at a couple of different shapes and movements from those synovial joints. Here's that picture of it though. So these are just two generic bones that are coming together. You can see here's this articular cartilage, this hyaline cartilage that's covering the two bones. In between them, you have this whole joint capsule. So everything around this connective tissue and included and enclosed in that connective tissue membrane, that is the joint capsule. So you have this darker synovial membrane here that's going to be secreting this synovial fluid. And again, this acts as lubrication, shock absorption, and prevents bone-on-bone action. But what can happen is that as over time, the bones, if you're especially doing a lot of high-intensity activity, if you're really kind of doing big ranges of motion with your joints, let's say you're really flexible and you're hyperextending all the time, or you're doing a lot of really intense weight-bearing activities or gymnastics where you're putting a lot of pressure on these joints, these two bones kind of will start to squish together more, and that increased pressure will start to tear on the synovial membrane. It can tear on the joint capsule. If there were bursa in here, it could rupture the bursa, and then eventually this articular cartilage can start to get worn away, so it's just the two bones grinding against each other. Here it is from the side. This is obviously a knee joint, so you can see there has these fat pads in here as well that provide some cushioning. Here's some menisci that are aiding in that as well. And a bursa right up here to allow this tendon nice easy movement. So this is a little bit more realistic of what a joint structure would look like. And you can see each one of these little spots is a potential spot for injury. All of these little things in here, and this isn't even showing the ligaments and tendons that are attaching in the knee. And so all those different places that you could have potential injury. Okay, so let's look at some more classifications of synovial joints. Your ball and socket joint, these are your most freely movable joints, and your shoulders, your hips, they provide multi-axial range of motion. So movement in all body planes. If you remember from Lab 1, Chapter 1, I think it was Chapter 1, it's definitely Lab 1, we talked about the different planes of movement. So sagittal, coronal, transverse planes, all that stuff. So now we're talking about multi-axial movement. Your condylar joints, your ellipsoidal joints, these are like in between your fingers and the bones in your hand, your metacarpals and your phalanges. They have this kind of rounded nobular structure. Nobular is a word, I guess, I'm going to use. And so it allows them to kind of rock back and forth on each other. So they can go back and forth, but no rotation. So it's a biaxial two-plane movement. Plane joints, gliding joints, these are like the ones in the wrists and the ankles, in between your vertebrae, your SI joints. They allow this sliding, kind of twisting movement, so we actually consider it a non-axial movement. And again, it's kind of this gliding back and forth. Hinge joints, this is like in your elbows and your knees. Uniaxial, only one plane of movement, but still pretty large range of motion when you consider just, that flexion and extension at the elbow and the knee. A pivot joint, this is like in between the first and second vertebrae. So you can rotate your head, you can turn it around. It allows that one kind of uniaxial movement around that sagittal plane. Saddle joints, this is like in between the thumb, your thumb joint, that kind of gives it that full kind of unique range of motion that our thumbs do have. It's shaped kind of like a saddle. I mean, I don't know how to say that. If you don't know what a saddle looks like, Google a picture of it. But it kind of is this convex, concave looking structure. And here's some pictures of it, so you don't even have to go Google your own saddle joint. So you can kind of see it has this interlocking, these two interlocking shapes that join to form that interesting movements at our thumb. And yeah, again, you can see, well, yeah, with 3D printers, it definitely makes replacing joints a lot easier if they can find some good materials the body doesn't reject. And you can print out of those, you can do 3D printing out of those. You can really get nice fitting joints rather than having to maybe do so much damage, and you can actually leave some of the original bone in place instead of having to, like with knee replacements, you actually take part of the femur, you take part of the tibia. Maybe with 3D printing, you can actually start to leave some of the remaining structures because you can match it so detailed to the already existing bones. This joint goes through the different types of joints, as well as the specific synovial joints with a description of the shape, the possible movements, and examples of the body. So highly encourage you to go through this, be familiar, be comfortable with all of these different joints, their examples, that kind of stuff. Okay, and so then these last couple of pages are just in joint movements. I'm going to go through this a little bit faster because this is somewhat of a throwback to, well, I guess we didn't really get into this in Chapter 1, but some of this stuff hopefully is just kind of straight memorization. There's no real intense concepts here. So when skeletal muscles move, they produce movement at synovial joints. So when we decide to bend and flex your elbow, your body is sending a signal to the muscles, and that joint is then moving. When a muscle contracts, its fibers pull its more movable end, what we consider the insertion, towards the fixed end, which is the origin. So origins tend to be closer to the midline of the body. They're more proximal, and they are not the most movable portion, whereas the insertion is typically the part that moves. This is not always a great way to think about muscle attachments, because generally the origin and insertion are both attachments, so they're muscle attachments. But it is kind of a way to help you organize that. I tend to just think about them as attachments. I don't tend to think about the origin versus the insertion. So some typical joint movements: flexion and extension. So flexion is decreasing the angle between two joints. So if you think about flexing your elbow, you're bringing your hand to your shoulder, and that is then, like if you put your finger right in the eye of your elbow and you bring your hand to your shoulder, you're going to squeeze your finger and tighten it. And then if you extend the elbow, take the hand away towards the floor, your elbow joint opens back up and you're increasing that angle. Lateral flexion, this is bending to the side. So if you, let's say you're sitting in a chair, like right now I'm sitting in a chair. If, there's something on the floor, I'm just going to, over here to my right, I'm just going to bend over towards the right to pick that thing up, I'm doing lateral flexion. Or if I take my left ear to my left shoulder, I'm doing lateral flexion at my neck. Hyperextension, so if you remember anatomic position, think about anatomic position with the palms facing forward, the fingers extended. That is a fully extended position. Your arms are straight, your fingers are straight, your head is upright. That is a fully extended position. So hyperextension is anything beyond normal anatomic position. So if you were to take your head backwards, that's hyperextension. If you were to take your hands back so that they're kind of behind you, that is hyperextension. Abduction versus adduction. So I always like to say abduction and adduction. Abduction is moving away from the midline. I'll show you this example in lab because it's always kind of funny to do. But if you think about abduction as being abducted by aliens, right? If I was abducted by aliens and they were beaming me up and then my arms kind of went out to the side and they reached overhead, that is abduction of my arms. And then let's say I was coming back down to earth and my hands came back down to my sides to anatomic position, that would be a deduction, adduction, because it's like I was adding mass back to my body. Here you can see examples of all that. So you can do abduction, abduction at the hips where you take your leg out to the side, and then adduction where it gets brought back in. Here's some good lateral flexion, and then flexion and extension at the knee. It's interesting, the knee is the only joint in the body that flexes posterior and extends to the front. So if you think about it, every other joint is going to flex to the front. So that's a little way that you might be able to help remember what is flexion. Oh yeah, flexion happens to the front of the body. Extension is almost always going to be going backwards. The only exception is in the knee. The knee flexes to the back and extends to the front. Some other movements that we see, especially these first two just on the ankle, is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. The ankle is another weird one. It's another joint that does not extend technically. The ankle does not extend. It only does flexion. Either dorsiflexion, this is when you kind of lift your toes up, you know, you're like, let's say you go to step on something, or you're taking your foot off the gas pedal, right? If you're pressing on the gas pedal, that's plantar flexion, pushing down, and then dorsiflexion is lifting the foot off of the gas pedal, because the top of the foot is called the dorsal surface of the foot. Like I said, plantar flexion, you're planting your foot down. Rotation, this is like in your neck, you can rotate there, you can rotate in your forearm. Circumduction, circumference, making a circle. This is only in your ball and socket joints, can only do circumduction. So it's kind of like swinging your arm in a circle. Pronation and supination are both paired together. This is a specific type of rotation in the forearm. So supination, you're turning your palms up. The way I was always taught, it's like, you know, if you think, if you were walking up to somebody and you were asking them for soup, and you didn't have a bowl, you just had your hands, you would turn your palms up and bring your hands together to ask for your soup, and that is supination. Whereas pronation is turning down. And so if someone is laying prone, they're laying face down. So if you think from anatomic position, if I were to turn my palms down, that would be pronating. And again, if someone is supine, it means that they're laying on their back so that they're facing up. Here you can see some of those actions, the dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, circumduction, going in a circle. This is medial and lateral rotation at the shoulder. This is also sometimes called internal and external rotation. You can see internal, it's coming to the midline, whereas external, it's being rotated out. It's kind of opening this joint up. And then supination versus pronation. Last couple of joints we can look at, inversion and eversion. These are only in the foot. So inversion, you're turning the sole of the foot inward. So let's say you kind of roll, like if you're rolling your ankle, right? You're walking somewhere and you just kind of roll it, and the inside of your foot turns up. The bottom of your foot turns inward. That's inversion. Whereas eversion is like if you kind of have like collapsing arches almost, where you kind of roll towards the inner edge of your foot, and the outer edge of the foot lifts up a little bit. Protraction and retraction in the jaw. Well, in the jaw as an example, you can also do it with your shoulder blades. You can push your shoulders forward or draw them back. But with your jaw as well, you can protract by kind of jutting your chin out, and then you can retract and draw your chin back. You actually do this while you're eating, you just don't realize it. Same thing with elevation and depression. You do realize that. You do see that you're doing elevation and depression. Elevation, closing your jaw, depression, opening your jaw. You do this with your shoulders as well. You can elevate, shrug your shoulders up, and then you can depress, pull your shoulders down. Here are those being depicted. All right, that's pretty much it for this lecture. Thank you so much.